Good day, fellow champions of inclusion. I am A. Ron, and this is the Inclusive Dad podcast, where we explore inclusion and make it practical. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe, rate, or review the show on your favorite platform. We truly appreciate your feedback and would be honored if you shared the podcast with friends and family who might benefit. If you want to support us in our mission, please click on the link in the show description. Today, my guest is Bryson Tarbet. Welcome to the show. Tell me a little
Thank you
bit
so
about
much.
yourself.
Yeah, I'm
Uh,
really excited to dive into this
yeah,
conversation. Like you said, my name is Bryson Tarbet. I am a former elementary school music educator. I am a proud foster dad to a 3-year-old. Most of the time is super sweet, but sometimes you know how they can be a little like dragons. But I'm really excited to chat a little bit about inclusivity because not only am I myself neurodiverse, I have sensory processing disorder and ADHD, but in my time in the classroom as well as in my graduate work, I've really been diving into inclusion and differentiation and how we can make sure that our classrooms, when we say are for everyone, actually are.
that's great. So yeah, before we started recording, a little bit of my story is I have a 22-year-old daughter. Her name is Cece. She just aged out of the um, traditional education system, but early on, she's what they classified as severely multiply impaired. So she's in a wheelchair, was sent across town to a segregated classroom. Didn't know about inclusion, didn't know about any of this stuff. So once we found out about it, tried to get her back in. It was kind of a struggle because once she was out of the gen ed setting, there was more hoops and stuff to jump through that she didn't have to have if she would have started there. So just want to talk about inclusion. So it's really an honor to have you on to get your perspective. So first question is, what is your definition of inclusion?
I mean, I think I already kind of alluded to it, which is, when we say it's a space is for everyone, so that could be a classroom, that could be, a public space, that could be, a store or anything like that. But when we say that it's for everyone, we really mean it. And we've done the work to identify the barriers for access and then take it one step further and break down those barriers and so that we can make sure that we can have a place and a classroom or wherever we are that is truly for everyone.
Yeah, that's great. Has that always been your definition or has it changed over time?
I mean, I feel like a lot of us in this world, as we learn more and as quite frankly, as the um, a lot of the conversations change, I think that I've had a little bit of a change in how I would define inclusivity. I mean, a lot of it is kind of all based in the same core language, the or core, understanding of it. But
Hmm.
like a lot of us, I've learned a lot about people speaking their truths and their understanding about different terminology that might have been applied, or labeling versus claiming a label. And I've done a lot of work around that myself as a disabled person.
Sure.
But I think at the core of it, my at least my goal, whether or not the means was fully fully accomplished, the goal at the core of it is just making sure that for me, in my case, my classroom was accessible to everyone.
Yeah, for sure. So how about you? Have you always been included?
That's a really good question. I I was diagnosed with ADHD from a very young age,
Okay.
and I kind of grew up. I had ADHD. Like that's just what this is. And it wasn't until just a few years ago that I was formally diagnosed with sensory processing disorder. And being in the classroom at the time, and being able to see the students that have SPD and things like that. I always said, if I was in school right now, I would be the kid with the headphones and the heavy vest. And then all of a sudden, one day, I go, dude, you're still that person. Kids with disabilities grow up to be adults with disabilities. And
Right.
I while I think everyone tried their best. I never had an IEP. I never had a 504.
Okay.
And there are definitely some times that I look back and I think I really should have, and there was definitely some things, especially, with the sensory regulation, that had some additional supports, I do feel like I would have been a little bit more successful in growing up. And that's part of my mission, is of spreading accessibility, is ensuring that teachers know how to make sure that their classrooms are set up for to set up our students up for success, because from a lot of the conversations that I've had, even with teachers that have taught me, were that, like we just didn't know. We didn't know what to do. We didn't really
Right.
know, we tried our best with what we had. And that's a really common theme when it comes to inclusivity in general, I think.
Yeah. So you said you did not have an IP growing up. Was that did your parents try to get one and the school didn't go for it, or they just didn't realize you needed one, or
Yeah,
why
so
didn't? Okay.
fell into this kind of weird box where I have ADHD, but I was also identified as gifted.
Okay.
So I learned a lot of really s- interesting strategies to cope and to mask. A
Sure.
lot of these that even just within the past few years, I've had to realize like, oh, that really wasn't a healthy way of getting through school, but it
Right.
got me through school. So like there were a lot of things where, even as an educator, if I would have looked at me now, if my parents would have tried to get me an IEP, I don't think I would have necessarily received anything that I wasn't already getting. I think a
Okay.
504 would have been really helpful, especially with that kind of emotional and sensory regulation.
Sure.
But I think part of it was also just where inclusivity was at the time. We obviously,
Yeah.
I'm in my 30s. Being going back just a few years, things are better than or are better now than they were then. But
For sure.
there still was a different disconnect of what quote unquote disabilities were, or even
Right.
how we ensured student success in our classroom. So honestly, I'm not sure I necessarily would have qualified or even received anything necessarily
Right.
with an IEP or a 504. But I do think about that a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. So my background is I before my daughter was born, and she was diagnosed with epilepsy at like 3 months old, I believe. So before that, I, growing up, don't remember the word disability being spoken. I don't remember in school, special education, anybody in wheelchairs, any of that stuff. So once she was born and introduced into this, I kind of call it like a parallel universe. Just it's out there, kind of running alongside stuff, and I didn't know anything about it. So did you have any exposure growing up to disabilities, or how was that for you?
I think a lot about my own experience with, basically how was school set up when I was a kid. And I really think, um, I think back, we had the quote unquote special ed room, and
Hmm.
they did their thing and we did our thing. And that was kind of how it was, unfortunately. There
Right.
wasn't, the inclusion really wasn't there.
Right.
One thing that really opened my eyes to how that fits into the educational setting is between my finishing undergrad and my first year teaching music. I actually worked as an educational assistant in the special ed world at an elementary school,
Okay.
and that was really cool to be able to see just how everything fits in together. It also gave me so much more context that, quite frankly, I would never have learned in undergrad about how to create an inclusive music classroom. And again, it's one of those things I think of a lot is, I always knew that, there were these students that were in this classroom, but we really didn't interact. We didn't really, I
Yeah.
saw them during fire drills, like it was one of those things where you really, there's this kind of duality of, I have not been out of the public schools for that long, all things considered, but education has changed quite a lot, and thankfully, in a lot of ways, for the better. We still have a lot of work to go, but I do
Right.
think we are kind of trending in the right direction.
Yeah. Why do you believe that music is for everybody?
I've just seen I've just seen music allow so many different types of students just be themselves.
Right.
I've seen students that, have come into my classroom with a ridiculous amount of trauma that they carry in from their home experiences. I've seen students who are, really high performers that really have put so much pressure on themselves because, they have to do well because everyone says they do. And I've also seen students that have really struggled academically and socially that have really blossomed in the music classroom because it allows them to try things from a different perspective.
Right.
Without getting too far in a tangent about standardized testing in the public schools, music class doesn't have a standardized test. There are
Right.
very few right or wrong answers. A lot of it is so much on a spectrum of what is creativity and what is musicality. And you know, on the flip side of that, there's also just so much research that shows that music and brain development are so inherently linked. I mean, you know, my one of my favorite things to tell people is that when you do use music, your corpus callosum gets thicker, which maybe you're not a super you know, neuroscience nerd like I am, but like
Yeah.
basically, you know, you have the two parts of your brain, and then in between you have the corpus callosum, which the thicker it is, it makes it more efficient to go from one side. So it's literally helping your brain work better by engaging in music. And I've just seen so many students receive so much wonderful outcomes because they were able to have music in their life. And I'm one of those students.
Yeah. So yeah, my daughter, she loves she loves music, loves singing. So I mean, our early memories of us, we'd go to church and she would just be sitting there just singing and belting out the words. And like for me, it was really cool because for me, if I'm singing, like I'm trying to see how other people are reacting to me, or if I don't sound good to myself, you know, I'm not going to just blare it out. Whereas she's praising God, she's just singing, she loves that. So I mean, for her, music's always been a big thing. We go to concerts and stuff. So I mean, it's a great. And she was always in choir. She loved being in choir, singing. So yeah, music it was always been a big part of her and our lives. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Do you go to concerts?
I'll be honest, I'm kind of one of those weird music teachers that like I don't listen to a lot of music
Okay.
because at least when I was in the classroom, you know, I was surrounded by it constantly. You know,
Yeah.
I love the idea of communal music. You know, if someone's like,
Yeah.
"Hey, will you go to this concert?" I will always be like, "Yes, let's do it." I just will
Right.
never be the first one to, you know,
Oh,
buy the ticket or something like that. But I am all for, you know, someone give me a little nudge to get me going.
gotcha. Have you? Is there like somebody you want to see in concert though? Like on your bucket list?
Honestly,
No.
I'm just kind of there for the vibe, you know. Like I
Yeah.
just like I've won some tickets from, you know, a radio station where I'm like, okay, you know, I would have bought these tickets, but I'm like,
Right.
I'm loving this. This is great. You know, we have all these people coming together to listen to this music. You know,
Hmm.
thinking about the production value and of it.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. I mean, I love going to concerts too because for me, it's like for whatever couple 2 3 hours, like you're there and like all the rest of the world just kind of disappears. You're
For
just in the
sure.
moment, listen to the music, yeah, the vibe, everything. So yeah, we kind of love it, but it kind of goes with bringing her in a wheelchair. I mean, then you have the whole piece layered on. Is it accessible? Like
Yeah.
how easy to get in and out? So then you got to deal with that stuff. But yeah, it's overall it's pretty good. What are accessible classrooms and how can teachers create them?
Kind of like I alluded to earlier, accessible classrooms are ones where the teachers had the time and the support to do the work of
Right.
recognizing those barriers and then removing them. From my experience in education, you know, we talk a lot about removing barriers, remove barriers, just differentiate. But the reality is we can't do any of that until we've identified the barriers. And I
Right.
think that's where we, as just you know, the educational system as a whole, we don't focus enough on figuring out where those are. You know, we notice, you know, oh, this student is not, you know, performing as expected, or all of a sudden, you know, this student's really struggling with X, Y, or Z, and we immediately go to adding supports, and supports are great, but like, where's the root of this? Because sometimes there's something that the only real answer is a support, but sometimes it's, hey, this student is really struggling in this class because there's no sound paneling on the wall. It's a cinder block wall with hard floor. There are
Right.
28 kindergartners in this room. It's loud. Can we get them
Right.
some headphones? Can we get them, you know, can we put some carpet squares down or something to try to help a little bit with
Right.
that? And that, I think, is really where it comes down to, you know, there, without getting too on a soapbox, you know, teachers often do the best what they can. The
Right.
reality is teachers often aren't given the time and the training to really zoom in and focus on what those barriers are. They they try to do a lot of things in the moment to try to make sure a student's able to access the curriculum, but sometimes it's beyond them. Sometimes it's, hey, this is a facilities problem. Sometimes it's, you know, this is a classroom grouping, you know, struggle. This is, hey, this student really needs a 20-minute break every 4 hours or something. And sometimes we have great administrators who are able to help with that and are able to work within the system they're in. And then sometimes, unfortunately, it's basically getting thrown back to the teacher to figure it out,
Right.
which isn't helpful for anyone.
Yeah. So yeah, part of our, like I said, my daughter was, I call it excluded, segregated. So then when we try to get her back into gen ed settings, she has a wheelchair, so the normal desk. I mean, she can't get her wheelchair under them. So she'd get into the room, but then she'd often be like in the back corner because there wasn't a desk. So then we had to, get something in there. And then still, they would set it kind of in the back corner because nobody else was using it if she wasn't in there. So then, that whole part about, okay, now she's in the room, sweet, but now she needs to be participating, not just back in the corner,
Yes.
doing her own thing. So there was a lot of that part.
Yeah,
So
that
do you,
is that.
go ahead.
I want to touch on that for a second because that is another thing I see a lot, especially when we have students that are attending music or whatever class with their non-disabled peers that they would and that's the only time they interact during the day. Maybe that's what their schedule is, and the teachers are like, I don't know what to do, and
Yep.
again, a lot of people try their best, but sometimes I just see, well, they're there, they're at the concert, they're on the first row, we'll put them
Yep.
on the end, and I'm like, that's not inclusion. That's an
No.
invitation. That's
Right.
just letting them be there. That's just opening the door. Inclusion is they are active participators. They are involved fully to the extent they are able, which is
Yep.
often more than we think they are.
Yes.
And to allow the students to actually do what we're doing and be involved in what we're doing, not just be there.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's another thing we talked about, like inclusion. Another thing that we came across was where, like, when I say inclusion, I mean, my definition usually is like full inclusion, and the school is like, well, yeah, they see other gen ed kids during lunch period. So for me, it was like we need to make sure that I need to understand what you're saying your definition is, because I'd say, hey, we want her to be included. Like, yes, let's do it, and then later on, you're like, that's not even close to what I'm thinking. So as a parent, one tip I have is if you're talking about words like inclusion or any of these things, just make sure that you and the school are kind of you understand what their definition is, because it'll save you some heartache if you don't, if you
For sure.
get figure that out up front, for sure. Um, how does play-based learning help student development?
That is a whole conversation itself, honestly. The reality is I come from the elementary world, and if you were to
Hmm.
walk by my classroom at any given time, you would probably be like, what is going on in there? um, because it's loud, it's chaotic, it's doesn't
Right.
look structured, it doesn't look like there's learning happening, but there's so much happening. I mean, just think about when you're figuring, you're a child, or you have a child, and they're just figuring out how the world works, and
Yeah.
they're just, we don't teach very simple concepts by having a bunch of preschoolers sitting at a desk and telling them, all right, if we stack up all these bricks and they fall down, they're going to fall. That's gravity. No, you give them some blocks and they build them a tower, and then they knock it down, and it's this awesome
Right.
thing.
Yep.
They're still learning in physics. They're learning how, cause and effect, and how the world is impacted by them existing and
Right.
and doing things on it. And the reality is, play-based learning is very rigorous. It doesn't have to look rigorous for learning to be happening. It just needs to have the learning happening, and that's one of the biggest arguments that I would get into, sometimes with teachers, is that, or even administrators who might be doing their evaluations, is they walk by and it just looks like they're having fun and playing a game. And I'm like,
Right.
yeah, we are having fun, we are playing a game, we're learning this skill, we're doing this, it's leading to this, where we're, this, it
Yeah.
connects to what we've done previously here. And play-based learning is learning, and I that is one of those hills that I will gladly die on, because it's just important, and it also, it works with the child's brain development, not
Hmm.
against it.
Yeah. I think you probably talked about it a little bit, but how has growing up with sensory processing disorder and ADHD changed your approach to teaching?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing is, honestly, I still kind of have epiphanies. Like, here, like,
Yeah.
I'll notice something, like, oh my gosh, like, that was totally me, or like, wow, that would
Right.
have been really, I'll learn a new strategy. I'm like, that would have been really helpful for me. The biggest thing that I think it's given me is empathy and even sympathy. Just understanding where the students are coming from. I had a kindergarten student a couple years back who came in, and he really struggled to do school. He was super sweet, but he was definitely neurodiverse, and standing still was not a thing. And, staying quiet was not really his thing. And, one of these, one day after class, and it was a rough class, like he struggled. But at the end of class, I don't know, held him back a little bit and I said, "Hey, do you sometimes feel like you are getting in trouble for things that you can't control?" And watching him immediately break down into tears, because I had pegged him. He was like, "Yes." And I'm like, "I understand. Like, when I was a kid, I was the exact same way. I really struggled pulling, keeping it together. I really struggled following the expectations, but that didn't mean I didn't want to." And I think going from that, and I'm not using this as an excuse for behavior or anything like that, because there are still expectations that you can hold, but the reality is there are sometimes students that the only thing they can do to make it through the day is survive, because they are just trying so hard to get your approval and to get your expectations and to meet those expectations. And for me, coming from that, of where I've had those days where teachers are yelling at me and getting snippy with me, and I am already trying my best, and they have no idea what happened in the class before. Bringing that into my teaching, I think, was one of the biggest um, eye openers and biggest ways to not only connect with my students and let them understand that I understand where they're coming from, but also just showing that, kind of like I said earlier, we exist as adults too, and that's okay, and we're just part of this world.
Are there things set up in the institution of education, where if maybe there's some slight changes that could be made to make it more friendly, for with students with ADHD, like stuff that we just do it that way because it's always been done that way, that maybe if we did it slightly different, it would be, helpful.
Yeah, I think there have been so many changes. I mean, for one, one thing that I always had over the ear headphones in my classroom,
Okay.
when it got loud. And when we'd have like an assembly in the gym, I would bring mine, and a teacher, they might have one or two, and we would just kind of bring them for students that might need it. And like, that's a
Right.
huge, like, for me, that would have been that would have been huge as a child.
Right.
And I think we're making a lot of changes, and a lot of schools are doing a lot of really good work. What I have noticed anecdotally, though, is we focus on creating these incredibly inclusive elementary schools, and then students go
Hmm.
to middle school and they're expected to
Yep.
figure it out.
Yep.
And that I'm getting a little upset talking about it, because that, just like we said, they don't grow out of it. They
Right.
still need that support. Yes, they're older, but they still need these supports.
Right.
And why are we focusing so hard on making an inclusive environment, which, as we should at the elementary level, and then we just kind of say, "All right, go figure it out now," and we're really not setting them up for success in middle school and high school. And I think there's
Hmm.
just so much more work that needs to be done at those older grades, to not only create institutional changes that help students be successful, but also allow our students to feel empowered to advocate for themselves, and to know what, if they have an IEP, what's on their IEP or a 504, or even if they don't have that,
Right.
like, to know what's helpful for them and to know what they need to be successful, and how to advocate for that. That is something that I think we are still very lacking as a whole in our society, is what happens when they get older. We
Yeah.
expect them to just figure it out, and that's not okay.
Yeah. I've recognized that also, where, elementary is pretty inclusive, and as you get older and older, it gets harder and harder. So that's definitely some things there that make causes that to happen, which needs to be looked into for sure. Absolutely. How has being neurodiverse in the workplace been a challenge?
That is also a really good question, because, like I said, I only realized I had sensory disorder, a few years ago. So I'd been teaching for quite a bit at that time, and for me, it started with realizing that I was getting really snippy by the end of the day, and I was just overstimulated. I started wearing different earplugs for different activities during the day to kind of help me kind of level things out.
Hmm.
There were times where, if I didn't have my earplugs and we had an assembly, I would literally grab one of my over the ear headphones and just wear them in the gym, because, again, visibility is important.
Yeah.
Um, but honestly, the biggest thing for me was realizing um, how much I've worked towards a point to, I went through high school, I went through undergrad, I went through grad school, all following these systems that weren't really working well for my brain.
Hmm.
And being kind of shifting from working in a public school to now running my own company, I'm able to make some of those changes to make it more accessible to my brain, and
Right.
to build my schedule around when I'm actually going to get my work done. And you know, I have to say it's kind of night or day how I feel at the end of the day, be working with my brain rather than against it. And I
Yeah.
think that alone is something that, I saw a Facebook post in one of our music education groups a few days ago, basically talking about accommodations in the workplace for teachers. And
Hmm.
there were some really upsetting conversations happening in the comments where basically administration was like, figure it out. And and again, we're talking about these teachers that are working in environments that we're working so hard to create inclusive
Right.
environments, and then we're telling the teachers to just figure it out because there's just so much. I love seeing the progress that we've made so far, but
Yeah.
goodness, there is just so much more we need to do as a society.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I've been more, actually the last 12 months, more like strategic about how I set up my days, give myself like breaks if I feel like I need them and stuff. And that, you're right, that does make a huge difference when you're able to like, instead of being having to be at work from 9 to 5 every day and like you don't have a choice, like being able to have more flexibility. Like, yeah, if I want to stack my stuff in the morning when I can focus the best, and then later on when I have trouble focusing, I can do other things. That's a game changer. And unfortunately, I feel like traditional jobs, it's hard. You can't really do that as much. So it's definitely, if you have your own business, that's one of the advantages I see for sure.
Yeah, one of the things that just kind of gets me going, it gets me upset is, we talk about, sometimes you'll hear the argument against inclusion and against accommodations and things like that. Well, what about when they get into the workforce? They won't be able
Hmm.
to do that. And I want to say, why not? Why
Right.
can't they?
Right.
That's you're More than one system can be broken at the same time. Like,
Yeah.
employers are able to do this as well. They just haven't done it yet. A lot of
Yeah.
them. And again, we still have work to do.
Yeah. And around here in Minnesota, they passed a law about the schools had to put a policy in place for cell phones.
Yeah.
So, our local school district, high school, the phones can't be out, I think, during class is what the rule is now. And I'm like, that makes, I mean, I understand what they're trying to do, but in a way, it doesn't make sense because, I mean, every postal employee, every UPS employee I see has AirPods in all the time. So it's like those jobs, they're able to, have their AirPods in to listen to music or podcasts or whatever they're doing. So it's just like, why are we, you know, in school we can't have it, but now they're out having a job, making a living, and they can. It just, again, it's just some of those things that don't make sense sometimes. Um, why did you start your business for serving other elementary school teachers?
Long story short, I didn't mean to.
You didn't mean to?
So, like I said, I started between undergrad and my first year of teaching music. I worked as an educational assistant,
Yep.
and as much as I love that, I miss the music classroom. So I
Okay.
started an Instagram account, that music teacher. It's the same one we still run today, and I basically just followed a bunch of other teachers to kind of live vicariously through their classroom. And
Sure.
then once I started teaching, I started sharing. But then during my first year of teaching, Instagram came out with this new thing called Instagram Live.
Okay.
And I was sitting in my office and I hit live on accident. And instead of turning it off, I just kept talking. And then, that turned into my podcast, which turned into video interviews, which turned into everything just kept spiraling. And,
Okay.
once I realized, like, oh, this is something here, it really came down to my goal of ensuring that all teachers have what they need to be successful and to set their students up for success.
Sure.
And we really have three values as a company, which is inclusivity matters, community empowerment matters, and advocacy matters. And I think all three of those things come down to making sure that the people that are in our world and are impacted by those people that are in our circle are
Sure.
able to advocate for change that's going to help all people and help all types of students and all types of populations and all types of families, and really kind of have that exponential impact of ensuring that the world's a little bit of a better place than when we started that in the morning.
Yeah, that's awesome. What is one tip you can share to help our listeners be more inclusive today? So something they don't have to like pay money or go to class for, just something they can just start doing today to be more inclusive.
Yeah, I think the big thing is just look at the world through a different lens. Something that I've noticed is, as I've done more work for inclusivity, I've kind of fallen into, like the TikTok algorithm of that world, and you start noticing that sometimes what you thought just was just something that happened, could be a real barrier in the world. I remember there's someone I have seen a lot on TikTok where she doesn't have much movement in one of her arms, and sometimes doors are just too heavy. So, for instance,
Hmm.
she would go around her college and basically rate which doors were not accessible because they were very heavy or
Yeah.
didn't have a
Right.
handle. They just had a knob, and they also didn't have some sort of automatic opener. And I
Sure.
think that when you start looking at the world and kind of looking for those barriers in your
Yeah.
own, in what you see as life, in the life that you experience, you can start making some action to advocate or to create some change to break those down. Because just like in teaching, we cannot do anything about the barriers until we recognize, label, and identify the fact that they exist and they are
Yeah.
here and they are hindering somebody else getting the fullest out of their life.
Yeah. That's great. Is there anything you want to talk about that we haven't discussed today?
I think we got into a lot of different subjects. I mean, I'm sure I could keep talking of, these, this is
Yeah,
clearly something I'm very passionate about.
for sure.
But really the big thing for me is to just realize that whenever you talk about inclusivity and try to make changes, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to get things wrong. You're going to use the
Right.
wrong words. Things are going to change. And the reality is just when you do better, or when you know better, do better. And until then, just keep trying your best.
Absolutely. So yeah, part of my journey was like I've talked about before is just we wanted our daughter to be more included than she was. So just and the school had a different view of inclusion than we did, so we kind of butted heads. Do you have any tips for parents that find themselves maybe in that situation where they want their child to be more included and the school's kind of pushing back? Any tips for parents on how to work with the school to remedy that?
Yeah, this is a very nuanced answer because unfortunately, the way other schools are funded is not really helpful sometimes. And it can become a balancing act with the districts of, what is a needed support and what is a support that would be nice. And
Right.
obviously that's a whole conversation right there that the professionals and the parents and the students themselves should be involved in.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
but the reality is sometimes you're going to have to go up against the district. Sometimes you're going to have to say, like, no, this is not this I think this is wrong, or I don't think this is enough because XYZ.
Yeah,
And while that's not always going to work the way you want it to,
yeah,
I think it's important to realize that for the most part, the parents, the teachers, and those that are actively involved, at least in like the micro setting, do want what's best for the student.
for
It
sure.
just might be, you might disagree with it, and that's okay. You're allowed
Right.
to, and you're allowed to say, coming from a place of we both want the same thing. You can say no. You can
Yeah,
say this. I think we need more, or
yeah,
I think we need something different, and have it a conversation. Try to go in it with that grace of understanding, and I say that to the teachers too.
right.
um, it's unfortunately it can be very emotionally charged when we have those things, and I
Yes,
think it's important for us to realize that we should be on the same page. Both teachers need to get this get this understanding, and parents need to get this understanding. But also there really does need to be some systemic change at a grander level to make it more accessible for
right.
these types of strategies and modifications and adaptations to be applied in a way that it doesn't become a game of balancing a budget, because that's not why we
No,
should do this. That's not how this is
yeah,
supposed to work. um
yeah.
and I think
That's
I'll leave it at that without going too much deeper into that.
yeah. No, that's great. Ready for the last question?
Let's do it.
Do you like spam? Yes or no?
I do love spam, but you got to cook it.
Gotta cook it. Yeah,
Got to cook it.
gotta cook it.
I can't say I was expecting that one, but I have to say I'm pretty impressed with how quickly I formed a response there.
Yeah. So I live in Austin, Minnesota, where they make spam and where the spam museum is. So if you're
Spam
in,
museum.
yeah, spam museum.
Fun.
Yeah. So I ask all my guests that, and it's interesting. Like, if it's usually a pretty fast response either way. If it's yes, it's a strong, fast yes, and if it's no, it's usually the same. There's not a lot of middle ground with spam.
Yeah, I think you're probably right there.
Yeah, where's the best place everybody can connect with you?
That Instagram account, that music teacher, is a great one.
Okay,
Thatmusicteacher.com is also kind of where we host all of our things, including some freebies for inclusion and universal design. And I'd love
awesome.
to continue this conversation wherever anyone wants to find me.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. To all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Inclusive Dad podcast. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, rate, or review the show. Your feedback helps us connect with more champions of inclusion. Remember to share this podcast with friends and family who might benefit. If you want to support us in our mission, please click on the link in the show description. Together, we can make the world more inclusive. Until next time, stay empowered and be a champion for inclusion.